Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining A4LI for this month's policy discussion. I'm very excited for the conversation we have planned today, and I hope all of you are as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brianna Deutsch, VP of Political Affairs at A4LI. In today's conversation, I'll run a discussion with Simon Rosenberg. Simon is the founder of the New Democrat Network and the New Policy Institute and has worked in Democratic politics for the better of 3 decades. In this conversation, we'll discuss Simon's strategies for moving policy issues onto party platforms and how he thinks the merits of longevity medicine can best be communicated to policymakers. Simon, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin by hearing a bit more about your background working in Democratic politics, and in particular, the work you did to educate policymakers about next generation technologies.
Part of what we did as New Democrats is that we had to take a big new argument and sell it to the Democratic Party and to the country. And so I was born in a movement that was about selling new ideas about the future, that was very future oriented in its politics, embracing technology, embracing globalization, embracing the modern world, and being new Democrats, right? And so that was the first experience I had, as being part of that campaign and part of the team that came to Washington to sell this new agenda. But then my organization was founded to sort of move that politics and that sensibility deeper into the Democratic Party. And we were set up in 1996. And I have really focused on a few things. I focused on promoting new leaders. You know, our organization in its early days was called New Leaders for a New Time, taking new people and bringing them to, into the system and helping them be successful in their elections and their careers. But we also focused a lot on developing new ideas and new strategies. And so where we've focused is on 3 big areas. One is globalization, understanding it, trying to master the economics and the politics around globalization. It's not just a domestic economic issue, it's also foreign policy. Second is changing demographics. The demographics of the United States are going through profound change. We've done lots of analysis about that and tried to help socialize that to political leaders and develop policy around that. And third was the changing media environment and how the country, that all of us are going through these radical changes in the way we all talk to one another, and to understand that and then help that also be better understood. So my whole career has been basically about helping develop new ideas and new sensibilities and bring them to market in Washington and around the country. And so I appreciate the kind of work that you're setting out to do.
Great. So, one of the initiatives A4LI has, or, is working on is putting together a longevity caucus. With your experience working with Capitol Hill, how do you think caucuses can best be leveraged to move policy forward?
It's a really good question, because I think they're both, they're necessary but not sufficient, is the way I would say it. And my view about this is that I think the opportunity that you have, and I even wrote pieces about this during the ACA battle in 2009 and 2010, is that now that the ACA is really here, and it is the way that we're solving one of the big healthcare challenges, which is to extend insurance and access affordably to more people, there really is an opportunity for the next big thing. And the next big thing to me was always going to be around health and wellness, chronic disease, the kind of space that you're in. I even wrote about this 12 years ago and tried to move some of these ideas into the ACA debate. But the ACA was big enough, right? It was a big chunk, and so I think that your strategy has to be to both develop a caucus, as you're doing, but also to develop individual relationships with people who may not be in the caucus, who are in positions of leadership and power, and who may not also be members of that caucus. And so you have to be able to do both, right? I mean, the caucus is a good idea, but you have to recognize it also have limitations, and that you need to make sure you're minding your P's and Q's on people who are the committee chairman and the more official power structures that exist outside of the caucus, right? The leadership of the 2 parties, the committee leaders, all that. You can do both, and they're not at odds with one another. They're complementary to each other, is how I would view it. But certainly a caucus can be very effective at bringing new ideas to market, socializing them, and some of them will work and some of them won't. I mean, the great thing about what they get to do is to market test things for you, right? And for you to see what they can sell to their colleagues and to get feedback. So they're early, it's a really critical function, frankly, because you don't really know when you start a project like this, right? You don't really know what's going to sell and what's going to be on the other end, right? If you get a series of bills or funding, you don't know what that's going to be. You got to keep the palette very wide, and you got to keep a lot of options on the table, because you don't really know what the end of the day is going to make it through the meat grinder of our political system.
Yeah, and sort of on that note, I mean, it's hard to find, policies that are bipartisan. And I know you've worked mostly on the Democratic side, but even to get Democratic initiatives through, sometimes you have to work with Republicans as well.
Yep.
So do you have any thoughts on how to create bipartisan relationships to move policies forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, and of course you have to be nonpartisan, bipartisan, right? That's that has to be at the core of your understanding of yourself, right? And I think what's most important is that for those members and senators, those House members and senators who are your early champions, to find people who are capable and comfortable working across the aisle, right? I think in part it's the culture that you establish is by, you should make it very clear to them, if they want to be a leader in this space, that you're expecting them to find either Democrat or Republican counterparts who can work with them. A very interesting example of that recently was some legislation that was introduced in the crypto space by Senator Gillibrand and Senator Loomis, who were sort of an odd couple. And you wouldn't have expected them to be together on anything, but they worked diligently in a very bipartisan way and put out a wide net of organizations and had tons of feedback, and their staff was very open to taking their initial drafts of what they wanted to do and getting feedback. And I really think in this day and age, it was kind of a model for how something like what you want to do will work. And I would certainly recommend that you sort of study their process that they went through, because what was great about it was they put out an initial draft of what they wanted to do, and then they took months of feedback, very open public feedback, because I know some people who are involved in this, and the product changed a lot, during the course of that. And I think that, as you're very well aware, by giving people the opportunity to weigh in, you're creating buy-in, right? And that's really important, right? It's not that you know what to do. You have an initial idea, you have some thoughts, you want to put it out there, and then every time somebody touches it and gives you feedback, they become invested in you and what you're doing. And so the process of developing feedback and creating open processes is really, really important in Washington. It's a critical. No one wants to take something that's already finished, right? It's everyone here is a policy nerd, and so they want to touch it and weigh in and massage it and whatever else. And anticipating that is a really critical part of what will be your success story here. Anticipating it and designing the process in a way that allows feedback, but also doesn't allow you to lose control either, right? Obviously, over what you're doing,
So, I mean, creating bipartisan relationships is one thing, but just getting a member's attention is another thing. So, there's always an infinite number of issues competing for a policymaker's time. So from your, 3 decades of experience working in politics, do you have any strategies for getting a member's attention, and sort of, more of what are the specifics on this? What's the process? Who needs to be targeted, and how?
Yeah, listen, we could spend an hour talking about that, and I'm happy to, get into the details with you, but let me give you a couple top line thoughts on that. One is that you have to start with staff. Staff have time to take meetings, and you have to be okay going in and meeting with staff. The good thing is the two of you are the same age as many of the staff, and they'll see you as contemporaries, and that's actually an advantage that you have, to be honest, because they will see you as peers with passion about something, and so therefore they should be open to it too, right? So actually your age is actually a real advantage in that regard. You'll be a little disadvantaged when you're dealing with members and senators, which is why I think one mistake that a lot of people in Washington make is they want to meet with a senator and the House member. I don't agree with that. I think you always start with the staff, in part because you can get meetings, and you need the meetings to get feedback, to sort of understand what's working and what's attractive, and you learn a lot through these engagements with staff, right? The second thing is, I do think you need to create, some public communications that either the two of you write, or if you have some of your member companies and your members to write about sort of softening the ground on the big arguments, excuse me, that you're making. I'm having some allergies today. I'm sorry about that. And so, so that people can see an op-ed or a blog, or that are written in political Washington English that's simple and easy to digest, right, is really important. And to continue to, make sure that you're developing that kind of that simple, approachable, digestible intellectual product for people, so that when you ask for a meeting with a staffer, you can send them 2 or 3 things that are easy for them to read and get their head around, right? Because look, I think you have the most important thing, which is you have a good argument, right? Like what you're trying to do is smart and good. And I actually think that we're ready for it. I think that the healthcare debate is ready for this, right? Because this last 12, 13, 14, 15 years of getting to the ACA where it is, we're about to sort of plus up the ACA subsidies. In essence, the project of getting the ACA up and running will be finished as of this year, potentially, right? We hope, if everything goes to. So then people who care about healthcare will be looking around for saying, what's the next big undertaking, right? What do we do now? And I think that you guys have a shot, frankly, of being one of the things, and particularly if the prescription drug stuff also gets done, right? Because that's another sort of big healthcare, goal of the people wars that people have been fighting, the healthcare wars that have been going on forever. And I think if those 2 things happen, and if Manchin plays ball and we get those passed in the next few weeks, there's going to be an opening for you to sort of say, hey, you guys have done 2 really big things. Let me argue what the next big thing is that you should be looking at. And I think having a 5 or 10 year time horizon, and doing, the retail side where you're pounding on offices, as well as developing the public kind of communications stuff that people can understand and identify with, is, what you need to do. And I think that once you start developing real champions, they'll help you develop a legislative strategy for how they see getting things through committees and playing the game that has to happen here. I mean, you can have your opinion about that, but at the end of the day, those kinds of decisions often get made by the members who carry your legislation, or whatever you need them to do, whether it's getting funding or however you want to engage. They often get to make those decisions about tactically how to execute. But I think the reason I'm here today is I think you've got a shot here at getting something meaningfully done in the next few years. It's where the conversation has to go in the country. And I just want to reflect upon something we talked about the other day, is that, today I know Norman Lear. I've met Norman Lear over the years. It's his 100th birthday today. Norman Lear is a cogent man who's still involved in the entertainment business. He's still very involved in politics. He produced a funny video, which you can go watch online. I think when I was growing up, the idea that there would be a 100-year-old person still making significant contributions to the life of the country was kind of unimaginable, right? I just don't think people were alive for 100. They weren't necessarily still taking big swings and doing big stuff. And I think just in the last few weeks, between Norman Lear and Jackie Robinson's wife, who's still very engaged in promoting his legacy, she just turned 100. This is real now. This is not, you guys aren't selling air, right? We have to really rethink totally how we're going to live in a society where people are going to be contributing significantly up until their 90s and their 100 in the next part of the decade. I don't think there's really any models or thoughts or policy around any of this. And it's here. It's not a hypothetical. It's not something of the future. It's here now. And I think it's exciting what you're trying to do, and necessary and important. And so I'm happy to lend a hand as I can as you do your good work going forward.
Well, we appreciate that. And you made an important point. It's not that Norman Lear is 100 years old. It's that he's 100 years old and he's healthy and productive, and living a great life. And that's the ultimate goal. It's
amazing. I mean, I was at the beach in Delaware this past weekend and this last week, and we may have talked about this, but it was amazing to me when I'd get up in the morning, and I'm, in my late 50s. I'm formally young, but I'm not old yet. And uh, it was amazing to me how many people who were much older than I was were outside exercising and walking and running and playing pickleball and all this stuff, at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. It was inspiring to me. It made my wife and I are like, crap. I mean, these guys are in their 80s. We got to get off our ass and make sure that we're, we don't want to be beaten to the punch by, the folks 20, 30 years older than we are. And it was really cool to see. And I live in a neighborhood where there aren't that many old people. So I'm not, I don't, I'm in a neighborhood where people are childbearing years and there's a lot of kids around here. And so it was really, I will tell you, it was eye-opening for me, just as seeing the kind of vitality that I witnessed myself with people who were clearly much, in their 80s and older. It was really cool.
Yeah, and it's encouraging to see those things. And this is, of course, is even before longevity treatments have really reached the public. So, of course, another important part of the conversation is the lifestyle factors, which obviously Norman Lear and others who are of that age probably have a very healthy lifestyle as well. And so we can't forget about that. Going back to sort of the political landscape here. So it seems like campaigns are sort of continuous on Capitol Hill these days, but officially now we're in the midst of midterms. And before too long, the presidential election will heat up again. So do you see, when it comes to moving policies forward, do you see campaign seasons as a distraction, or are there also potential opportunities there?
Yeah, so the way the rhythm of this city works, right, is that we're now finishing, Congress meets for 2 years. So it's always a 2-year project. And your goal, is to try to get stuff moving in the next 4 to 5 months so that when everybody comes back here in January, your stuff is starting to move through the system, right? Or at least in various stages of discussion or deliberation. And then you've got a 2-year window, because the way legislation works, if you're looking to do legislation versus just plussing up funding, for example, the budget's done every year, but Congress has 2 years to pass legislation. So if you pass a bill in the House or the Senate, it has to be signed into law at the end of 2 years, or the clock restarts, right? And, so it doesn't, if you don't get it fully to the president's desk, it's like it never happened. You have to go do it all over again, right? And so having, you should be now at a strategy level deciding what your next 2-year strategy really is, and working really hard to make sure that it's in place by the time everyone gets back here in January. I don't know what's going to happen here over the next 2 years. I think that I think the advantage you have is that I think Democrats will be looking to the next stage of the healthcare discussion if we, as I said, have sort of made great strides on ACA and the prescription drug pricing issue. And Republicans have, their coalition is much older than Democrats, right? And so you have this bipartisan opportunity, because Republicans should, in theory, right, be more interested in what happens to people when they get old, because their coalition is substantially older than the Democratic coalition. So I think that creates an opportunity for you to create a bipartisan approach for whatever it is you feel like you want to try to get done. But I want to stress this, that in addition to the longevity treatments that you're talking about, this step before that, right, of establishing demographic realities and the data around aging and how much older people are. And I know that there's been a drop in life expectancy in the US in recent years. My instinct is that's a temporary thing based on COVID and just some other externalities. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I think, first of all, establishing sort of a baseline about how much older the kind of vital lives people are living already, right? And needing to start to establish policies around that, strategies around that, so that if we continue to extend lives beyond that, there's already a theory of longevity, as you've it's a good concept, I think, right? That you're establishing what's already happening, and to say, imagine if the average person lives 10 years longer than that. I mean, how do we manage all that? And I think there's, I think something as simple as the fact that the retirement age in the US is 65 is one of those things that you should be thinking about, right? In terms of engaging on. It is silly in many ways. And it's something that is a little bit of a third rail in Washington, but it's something that it's time for there to be a rational conversation about that, because I don't know that retirement is really the aspiration any longer, right? And it's just simply things like that, right? That I mean, the whole retirement system, right, was predicated and built on the idea of people who did physical labor and manual labor who had to retire because their bodies couldn't continue. And that's why that's why the labor unions, for example, in the US are so adamant about keeping the retirement age at 65. Well, I hope I never retire, right? I have no aspiration to ever retire. And I think even language around the concept of what it is to be older as opposed to retiring is an area, like a first layer set of discussions and events you could be having in Washington, right? That I think would be really important and interesting to start creating that dialogue, because it's a dialogue that's not happening, right? It's just not present in the system. People who would be interested in that have just been busy doing other things, right? To the point you raised earlier. So I think there's a first layer set of things you can be doing that are conversational, strategic, and then there's the tactical, what do we really want to get done in Congress, right? It's the knowledge we want to bring, and then the outcomes we want to fight for. And they're two separate, they're related, but they're different, right?
So final question from me. So you sort of mentioned the media before, and we know, the media plays a large role in circulating the information that both policymakers and the overall public has access to. And that can sort of inform a lot of people's opinions on topics. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience working with the media and the best practices you've learned for catching their attention and getting them to publish articles that are helpful to your cause?
Yeah, I think first of all, you have to be super aggressive. This is the competition to get ideas into the marketplace here is very, very intense. And for those with business backgrounds, the media in Washington is very different than traditional business media. It's far more adversarial and much tougher, frankly, than traditional business press, right? Which is often very fawning and kind of almost like sports coverage, right? That's not really what happens here. I think in terms of breaking through to policymakers, I think that you need a big argument, which you have. You need spokespeople, which you have. You need you need to be both aggressive and patient, right? It could take 2 or 3 years before you start having the credibility of being a serious thing that gets considered, right? To be, you have to be patient and impatient, perhaps at the same time. And you need to be creative, right? About how you turn these big arguments into something that's interesting for the media to cover. How do you create stories? There are lots of terrific firms here that you could hire that are expert in this kind of stuff. I can help introduce them to you if you have the resources to I know people who specialize in healthcare, and also I know some creative people that could be helpful to you. But I think you have to be realistic about what you said. I think your orientation is smart, right? This is going to take work, but you have to do it, and you have to be confident, and you also have to be bulletproof in your arguments, right? You're up against very, very smart journalists who are able to call BS and stuff very easily, right? And because everything is pitched to them all the time. And so your materials and your arguments and your data has to be, bulletproof, right? And you can't be anything, oops, we made a mistake, we got these numbers wrong. There's zero margin of error here on things like data and analysis. There's zero margin of error in Washington, and because that And I don't think people really understand that. I mean, this is a very competitive intellectual and debating space, right? You got the smartest, most capable people who make arguments in the whole country, right? But I think that you've got something interesting and to sell, and I think you can be successful. But you also never know when you're going to break through. I mean, I've had a very big media success in the last few weeks with my own work around making a big argument about the election, and I've tried to change the understanding of the election, of it being an election where there was a red wave, as they were calling it, a lean Republican election, to one that looks more competitive. Well, I've been making this argument since November. And then I re-engaged in it in May in a very significant way. And then I pounded and pounded and pounded, and I produced analytical memos, and I called every reporter I knew, and and finally, I broke through. And, I will tell you that when you break through in something like this, you just never know when it's going to happen. But when it happens, it's like a wave. You got to ride it, and you got to, because it is feast or famine in many cases, right? With media, is that, other media call you because they see you quoted, and you've got to milk as much as you can. When you're getting that, when you've got your 15 minutes of fame, you got to ride it. So, I did 2.5 hours of press interviews today already, based on this big argument I've been making, and they were all inbound calls, right? These are not things that I initiated. They reached out to me on Twitter and other stuff. And so I will tell you that when I began this effort, was I confident that I was going to break through and end up in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the other places? I wasn't confident, and I worked really hard and pushed really hard, and I was super aggressive, and I was right, which really matters, right? And so, you've got to be both patient and impatient, I guess is what I would say, and really smart. You have to be super smart. You can't. There's just a big, BS detector here in this town, and so because everybody's selling something, and so, but I think you've got something good to sell, and I think you'll be successful as long as you're both patient and impatient in selling it.
I like that advice. And Simon, thank you so much for joining us in what appears to be a very busy day and busy week for you. And congratulations on that success.
Yeah.
So again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you next month at next month's policy discussion.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck.
Thank you.